Right now, physicists are using a century-old set of mathematical formulas to decode the mechanics of string theory and map the behavior of black holes. These equations originated from an impoverished shipping clerk in India, who claimed a Hindu goddess whispered the results to him while he slept. His name was Srinivasa Ramanujan. He grew up in a small room in Tamil Nadu, India, with practically no formal mathematical training. How does a mind completely isolated from the global scientific community generate mathematics that still helps us calculate the entropy of a black hole? In professional mathematics, knowing the correct answer is only half the job. The absolute law of the field is that you must prove your work. You have to document the logical steps you took to arrive at your conclusion. Ramanujan didn't operate that way. His primary education came from a single dry textbook containing 5,000 advanced theorems with 0 proofs attached to them. Using that book as a training ground, his brain learned to skip the traditional logic entirely and leap straight to the intuitive result. Because he thought purely in numbers, the standard school system had no idea what to do with him. When forced to sit for exams in English comprehension or dissect animals for physiology, he handed in blank papers or sarcastic notes. Those academic failures triggered severe consequences. His college revoked his scholarship, leaving him without a degree and plunging his family into extreme poverty. To survive, he took a low-paying job tracking cargo at the Madras Port Trust. By day, he worked as a clerk. By night, he sat alone and furiously filled notebooks with original, undocumented mathematics. A rigid, standardized educational system had effectively discarded a generational genius, entirely because he couldn't process information the traditional way. In 1913, Ramanujan gathered his most complex formulas, packed them into an 11-page letter, and mailed them across the world to G.H. Hardy, a leading mathematician at Cambridge University. When Hardy opened the envelope, he initially thought the messy pages of bizarre symbols were a joke. But as he looked closer, the reality set in. The equations were entirely new. No European mathematician had even conceived of these concepts. Hardy immediately invited him to England. For Ramanujan, this meant accepting an immense personal risk. Tradition dictated that if a Brahmin crossed the ocean, they lost their caste entirely. Driven by his mathematics, he boarded a ship anyway. He arrived at Trinity College in the spring of 1914, just as the First World War began to rip Europe apart. It was a profound collision of worlds. A deeply religious man who relied on divine intuition was suddenly dropped into the cold, relentlessly logical center of British academia. The alien environment immediately took a toll. Ramanujan didn't know how to use an English fireplace to stay warm, and wartime rationing made his strict vegetarian diet nearly impossible to maintain. He was freezing, and he was starving. Yet, in Hardy's office, the math flourished. Their working dynamic was a perfect counterbalance. Hardy aggressively demanded structured step-by-step proofs, while Ramanujan delivered raw, brilliant leaps of logic. The concept of partitions became their defining mathematical challenge. The partition function calculates how many ways you can add whole numbers together to create a larger number. This diagram shows how the number 5 can be expressed in exactly 7 different ways. Watch what happens as the target number grows. By the time you try to partition 100, there are over 19 crore different combinations. Calculating that by hand is impossible. Navigating that sheer scale required Ramanujan's unique intuition to build a functional formula. The synthesis of Hardy's rigor and Ramanujan's insight was highly effective. Together, they published 21 revolutionary papers in a span of just 2 years. The academic establishment had to concede to his brilliance. The man with no college degree was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, placing his name alongside historical titans like Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. Yet, just as their collaboration reached its peak, Ramanujan's body gave out. The stress of the war, the freezing climate, and chronic malnutrition had permanently broken his physical health. Confined to a London hospital bed and severely weakened by tuberculosis, Ramanujan could barely stand. But the disease hadn't touched his mind. When Hardy visited, he casually mentioned his taxicab had a rather dull number, 1729. Without missing a beat, Ramanujan replied that it wasn't dull at all. It was the smallest number expressible as the sum of 2 cubes in 2 different ways. His calculation was instantaneous. By 1919, doctors determined that staying in England would kill him. He was sent back to India, permanently separating the greatest mathematical duo of the century. Even bedridden in Madras, he kept calculating. In his final days, he wrote out what were known as Mach theta functions, formulas so advanced that the scholars back at Cambridge couldn't comprehend them. Ramanujan passed away at just 32 years old, leaving behind thousands of unproven results. Original formulas that took the rest of the world nearly a century to verify. Decades later, Jawaharlal Nehru reflected on Ramanujan's brief life, viewing it as a symbol of the harsh realities facing millions of people. His global impact was essentially a statistical accident. Ramanujan was a brilliant mind who barely escaped being entirely suppressed by rigid bureaucracy and crushing poverty. If an uneducated clerk, armed only with a piece of slate, could write equations that help us understand the universe, how much human potential do we lose every single day? True innovation doesn't rely solely on elite institutions. It depends on whether we can find, feed, and encourage the millions of brilliant unseen minds currently trapped at the bottom of the system.